Hi guys, and welcome to this Economics and IB revision based on protectionism. More specifically, this slideshow is on tariffs, a form of protectionism. So what is a tariff? Well, first of all, what is protectionism? Protectionism is the implementation of barriers to trade such as tariffs, quotas and subsidies. And I'm going to do subsequent videos on quotas and subsidies for you to have a look at. Well, a tariff, though, is a tax on imports, and it's designed to push up the price of imported products and hence protect domestic industry from competition from overseas. By putting in place a per unit tax, you are pushing up the price of imports. That clearly should help your domestic producers to then compete at that higher price level, as they aren't as efficient as that overseas producer that is selling in your country. As a real life example we're going to have a look at later is the Trump and his 25% tariff on Chinese steel that he tried to put in place in 2018. These will have clear stakeholder effects, and we need to use these in our evaluation in our essays. And so I'll gradually work through these now, and then I'll go on to a slide with a picture of the diagram, which we can talk about with a labeled diagram. So first stakeholder we're going to think about is consumers. Consumers are going to be worse off because if you think about it, by putting in place a tariff on imports, you're pushing up the price. So they're worse off as they pay a higher price, and they're going to move upwards along their demand curve, so they demand less. They also lose consumer surplus, as we'll see on the diagram in a second. The next stakeholder we're going to be looking at is the domestic producers. Clearly, they're going to be better off as they can now charge a higher price because they're already within the country. They don't have to import. So they're going to be better off. They can compete at that higher price level, and they're going to gain sales within the country. Okay, so we'll see on the diagram that their actual quantity of sales increases, and thus their producer surplus increases. And we'll have a look at that on the diagram in a second. The next stakeholder is the overseas producers who were importing into our country. Well, they're going to be worse off because imports are going to shrink, and that's the whole point of the tariff, is to reduce imports. So it's a nice easy one to remember for your evaluations that overseas producers will be worse off because imports will shrink. The government, well, they are affected. They gain tariff revenue because they're going to get the amount of tax per unit times the number of units imported. And so they're going to gain tariff revenue, which could be spent elsewhere within the economy. There are some issues created with tariffs, though, in that the domestic income distribution is going to worsen because of the regressive nature of tariffs. That means that lower income families end up paying more as a percentage of their income than the higher income families when they buy something in from abroad, and so it's going to hurt them more. It's a regressive tax, and welfare loss is created. Tariffs are not efficient. They are inefficient. We'll see on the diagram that welfare loss is created. Adam Smith and Ricardo would not like tariffs. So here is the diagram, and I've fully labelled it up. This is how I'd like you to label your diagrams in an exam. You can see price and quantity on the axes, and we start with an import diagram. Always go domestic supply, domestic demand, and then whack in your world price level. That's going to create your Q1 and Q4 points to come down. That is your imports before the tariff is put in place. So you can see huge amounts of imports coming in this diagram, Q4 minus Q1. But as the government gets grumpy and wants to actually put in place its tariff to try and protect their domestic industry, you can see what happens. WP increases to WP plus tariff. And so it pushes up the price level, and therefore we can see that imports shrink to Q3, Q2. The reason being, domestic demand sees that high price and we move upwards along our demand curve to G, and so therefore Q3. But then our domestic suppliers, they're more incentivized, aren't they? They're going to want to produce more at that higher price level, and so they move upwards along their supply curve to H, and we see domestic supply increases to Q2. So what are all those letters? Well, those letters on that diagram just stop you from shading in areas and overlapping and creating a bit of a mess. It keeps the diagram tidy, and it also means that in your essays you can then refer to it. And you can see in my table at the top right how I've referred to the different letters. So A, B, C at the bottom left there is the domestic producer surplus before the tariff is put in place. And that increases to AIH. You can see that triangle increases in size because domestic producer surplus increases because the domestic producers are protected. For consumers, though, we said earlier they are worse off. The consumer surplus before was a large triangle JBF. However, because the world price shifts up to world price plus tariff, you can see that that triangle shrinks to JIG, and that's the consumer surplus after. Okay, so it's the area above the price beneath the demand curve there, JIG. I've also marked on there two triangles. You've got HCD and GEF. They are the welfare loss associated with this. No one gets that. It's lost. It's welfare given up. And so therefore, that is what tells us that this tariff is inefficient, because before the consumers were getting that within their consumer surplus, JBF, that is now welfare lost. And so that tells us that putting in place protection, in this case the tariff, is inefficient. And then finally on our diagram we can see HGED, the rectangle in the middle. Well, that is the tariff revenue achieved by the government, okay, because it's the imports after the tariff are put in place, and it's a per unit tax, and so it's the amount of tax times by the number of units that are being imported. That tells us what the complete revenue would be for the government from this tariff. Okay, so that's your tariff diagram. That's very important to get into your analysis within your essays, but you can then use it again for the evaluation because you're talking about the stakeholder effects. So let's put that down with some application and context. Very important for A-level is 20% of your grade to be able to talk about what's been going on in the world, and in IB it's very important too. So let's have a think about that. So Donald Trump, probably one of the most famous heads of state that's been in the world in recent years. Love him or loathe him, most people loathe him, but here he is. And what did he do? He wanted to put in place, and he did put in place, a 25% steel tariff on imports of steel into the US. The reason being, politically, the steel producers are in the areas that would vote for Trump. And so therefore, he wanted to protect employment in that region to actually try to gain votes, look after the employment within that region. Trump's strategy centered on shielding the US steel mills from foreign competition with a 25% tariff, and that was done in March 2018. Trump planned to increase infrastructure works and house building because they use a lot of steel. So what he wanted to do was then ramp up the demand for steel at the same time as protecting the domestic steel industry to then be able to use that steel, create employment within the domestic steel industry. Now, that's all well and good, isn't it? We're protecting the domestic industry there, we're creating employment, it's going to lead to economic growth. But we need to think about the other side of this. The United States are large users of steel, not least in construction, in weapons manufacturing, the largest manufacturers of weapons in the world, but also their automotive industry. They're huge producers of cars, Ford being a massive company that's American, Chevrolet, for instance. And so they use a lot of steel. Now that increase in steel price by 25% overnight is not going to go down well with those producers, is it? Because the higher steel prices resulting from the tariffs dented demand within the auto industry and other steel consumers like the weapons manufacturing industry. And so actually, where Trump on one hand is creating employment within his steel industry, he's taking away, unfortunately, with the other, because the users of steel are finding steel more expensive and therefore just dropping back on their production and not performing so well, and it dents their profitability. And so actually employment within the steel users was being hurt. And so this is a really good example because you can analyze about the positives of the steel tariff that Trump put in place. It protected from the cheaper Chinese steel. He was very grumpy that China were able to dump subsidized steel within America, and so he was protecting his steel workforce and gaining votes because of it. But on the other hand, your evaluation, well, actually he's hurt many industries there which are important to the US economy, and so actually was it a good idea? And so balance your argument for your evaluation. Okay, so that's that on tariffs. I'm going to now create another video on quotas and then the following one on subsidies. So we'll have covered all of the protectionist diagrams that are required for A-level and IB economics. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will see you next time.